So I wanted to make a video talking about the original Spider-Man trilogy from a technical standpoint, but every time I tried to put my thoughts together, it was neither factual nor an argument. So I figured it'd be best for me to make a love letter to the trilogy one film at a time. I wanted to make this video a combination of memories I have, merchandise I remember having, and most importantly, what I love about this movie. There are some things that instantly come to mind when I think about this movie. One of those being the AT&T commercial that would play on the VHS tape. I practically have this TV spot memorized as I've seen it 100 times. I remember this web shooter I had that came from a box of cereal. I actually ordered one recently just out of pure nostalgia, but I don't even think I liked Kellogg's cereal at the time. I just wanted the web shooter. And don't even get me started on the various Lego sets, puzzles, and action figures I would constantly play with. I remember my grandparents would get annoyed at me sometimes because I would litter their house with Lego pieces. And I remember when the movie first came out, my grandpa would pretend to be the Green Goblin and I would pretend to be Spider-Man so he could put me to sleep. I also vividly remember the festival readers books that would be at the Scholastic book fairs. And I absolutely did have a Spider-Man costume. Yes, I wore it for Halloween, but I also wore it to school, around the house, and to Home Depot. My parents were definitely worried. I remember the first time watching the movie. I was almost 4 years old at the time, and I watched it with my dad in Puerto Rico. Two things I remember from the first time I ever watched it was I got terrified at this goblin jump scare. The second one being that the instant the movie ended, I asked if we can come back and see it again, and my grandpa and dad laughed. Production. A huge part of what makes these movies so iconic and filled with nostalgia is the soundtrack. Danny Elfman's theme is phenomenal and it gives me goosebumps when I listen to it. You're going to hear me at various points reference when I love the music throughout the movie because the music in this movie is just that good. And don't even get me started on the costume design. The costume in this first movie is nearly flawless. I say near flawless because they make it better in the second and third movie. It adapts the essentials of the comic book, but also expands on it, making it a great and realistic take. The reds are so vibrant, and the raised silver webbing adds so much depth. I also love the sharp-edged lenses that are aesthetically pleasing to look at. I remember when Spider-Man 3 was about to come out, I was about 8 years old, and I messaged Spidey Planet on YouTube, asking him how much he charges for a replica of the suit because I was so obsessed with it. Of course, being 8 or 9 at the time, I had no money or actual intention of buying it at that time, but I hope that one day when I was older, I'd be able to buy one. I'm not sure what the general consensus is about the lack of web shooters in this trilogy, but I actually really like it. The web shooters were originally going to be in the movie, however it got scrapped for organic webbing. I just like this because it seems to be more convenient for Peter, but it's also a good way to distinguish this version from its comic counterpart. So this movie is almost 20 years old, and I will absolutely admit that some of the visual effects can be quite spotty at times, but in my opinion that makes it funny to watch. Call me naive, but I didn't realize that this shot was actually a CG Spider-Man until a couple years ago. Throughout the trilogy, Raimi does this thing where he blends CG shots and practical shots, and he does it really well. A good example of this is seen when Peter's chasing Uncle Ben's killer. As he's running down the alleyway, he gets covered for a second, and when we see him again, it's a completely CG Spider-Man. I also absolutely adore the montage scene where Peter is creating costume ideas in his room. The scene was crafted so masterfully, and it looks like it was ripped right out of a comic book. With each design that gets ripped out of that notebook, we get closer and closer to the design we all know and love. The movie. Something the Raimi films do best is how they deal with the characters. Alex over at High Top Films made this point pretty well in his video, so I won't harp on it too much in mine, but this movie has masterclass exposition. We learn so much about the characters and their relationships within the first 5 minutes of the movie. Raimi gives each character an arc. We understand so much about them through explicitly stated things, but also through things we are left to infer for ourselves. MJ has this subtle arc of wanting to be accepted for her career choice. Harry has this arc of longing for his father's approval. The Amazing Spider-Man films had Gwen, but her wants and needs weren't as overtly shown as MJ's were to me. In the Amazing Spider-Man movies, Harry was introduced to us in the second film, and it was forced upon the viewer to feel as if they've been friends forever. It doesn't really feel earned to the viewer because we're seeing about it and hearing about it for the first time. Homecoming and Far From Home are the worst with this because any character that isn't Peter is just so forgettable and we know nothing about them. I'm talking about MJ, Flash, Ned, Betty, and others. I love the way Peter Parker is characterized in this film. He's the kid who sits alone at lunch, he gets picked on, even when he wins a fight like a badass, he still isn't accepted by his peers.
Jesus, Parker, you are a freak.
I love the scene in which Peter crawls up a wall for the first time. He sits in an alleyway and he looks up at a spider crawling in a web that kind of parallels himself. Again, the music is awesome in this scene, and I love how we can see how he's able to stick to walls. So I mentioned earlier the visual effects can be cheesy at times, but there's also just a fair share of cheesy moments like this quadruple backflip Peter does in the hallway. I like to think that my favorite scene in this entire movie is a bit unique compared to most people's. It's actually the car chase scene right after Uncle Ben dies. This is because in my mind, this is the moment that Peter becomes Spider-Man. The first attempt at web swinging doesn't go that great, and it's good for comic relief. We get a lot of funny moments in this movie of Peter trying to learn how to use his powers, which is always great. The first few times he uses his powers is out of curiosity. This time it's out of pain. He wants to use his newfound responsibility to catch the guys that got Uncle Ben. At the same time, he's getting the hang of swinging through the streets of New York with the chilling revenge track from Elfman. It perfectly embodies the character of Spider-Man in multiple ways. The iconic birth of Spider-Man, learning how to swing, but also acting out that whole "with great power comes great responsibility" theme. I love the great performances by J.K. Simmons and Willem Dafoe. The final fight scene with the Green Goblin in this movie is honestly a bit underrated in my opinion. This is probably one of the, if not the most brutal superhero fight scenes. It's almost like you can feel each punch that lands on Peter. You can tell when he gets hit or falls on his back that he gets the wind knocked out of him. Last time I talked about the music, I promise, but the music that plays when the Green Goblin dies is also the same music from the train scene in Spider-Man 2. And wow, this is probably Elfman's best score. It's so peaceful and angelic, yet so heroic at the same time. Obviously, the theme of this first movie is responsibility. Peter goes from an arrogant kid who tells Ben "you're not my father" to saying that Ben Parker was his father. I'm pretty sure when I stop recording this and post it, there's going to be a couple things that come to mind that I should have talked about. However, these are the main ideas and kind of my comprehensive experience with this film. I do think this is the best superhero movie origin story, even though it's almost 20 years old. Should the rumors be true, which I'm a little biased and I think they are, I'm excited to see this cast come back.